China is one of the 21st century's most consequential nations. It has never been more important to understand how the country is governed and what its leaders and its people actually want and believe. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system and the trajectory of China's domestic and foreign policy. I'm your host, Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. This is Pekingology. China is increasingly defining the future of robotics and embodied AI. Factories in China installed more industrial robots over the last 5 years than in any other country combined. And in 2024, Chinese companies hit a major milestone in overtaking foreign players as the dominant supplier of robots for at least the domestic market. To unpack China's embodied AI ecosystem and the politics around it, I am very pleased to be joined today by Wendy Chang, Senior Analyst with MERICS and a leading expert on the intersection of Chinese technology, politics, and economics. Wendy recently published a fantastic new report with co-authors Rebecca Artasadi and Altane Genisova titled Embodied AI, China's Ambitious Path to Transform Its Robotics Industry. Wendy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Wendy, how did you reach this point in your life where you spend your time telling all of us about how China's robotics ecosystem really works?
Well, I started out my career as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. So I did that for many years. And then I moved to Berlin about 6 years ago, where I discovered this ecosystem of being in policy in the think tank world to do a little research about China and combining my interest and expertise in tech and a little bit of internal knowledge being Taiwanese American to now track tech policy, basically.
Great. Well, thrilled to be able to borrow some of your expertise today. Hoping we can start with just a quick history of the Chinese robotics industry. How did we get to this moment in which it seems like really even over the past few months or year in the US anyway, there's been a growing recognition that China is starting to lead the world in key aspects of robotics and embodied AI. So how did we get here?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, China is already the world's largest market for industrial robots, given its massive manufacturing base. And over time, they've shifted towards producing more and more of their own robots. So they're both manufacturing and installing a lot of their own robotics as part of their industrial automation. Now, as we well know, there's also a very successful EV industry in China, a whole supply chain producing very good and very cheaply these electric vehicles. So when you combine those together, you have the perfect ground to make also humanoid robots. So autonomous robots that are now kind of the cutting edge of robotic sector. In 2023, China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, they designated humanoid robots as a disruptive technology. And that really sets a goal to achieve advanced mass production for advanced robots. So since then, that opened the door for industrial policy and also for capital, both public and private, to flow to the sector. And the sector has really flourished ever since. And because there's so much overlap with both industrial robots and with EVs, that has really allowed humanoid robots to take off very quickly.
And compared to the sectors that we see in the US or in Europe, where has China pulled furthest ahead when it comes to robotics, when it comes to embodied artificial intelligence? And then are there any areas in which Chinese robotics have been any way less impressive?
I think where China succeeded in the most so far is in being an integrator. So somehow they're able to put together whole robots, especially humanoid robots, for a lot cheaper than Western competitors. And that's due to their very complete manufacturing base and supply chain. Of course, when it comes to powering humanoid robots or powering EVs, China has its own leading battery sector, so that they're ahead in. They're moving to own almost the entire supply chain on the hardware side. So for industrial robots, they're starting to take a dominant position, especially in smaller industrial robots. In the very high end, massive, big industrial robots, still dominated by the traditional big four, which are European and Japanese companies. But China is actively working towards moving up that chain. And that means fostering companies to produce the key high precision parts domestically to slowly domesticate the whole supply chain.
You mentioned humanoid robots, which have featured very prominently in recent PRC propaganda, some of which is quite entertaining, honestly, and also has featured prominently in many Chinese companies' marketing materials. It does seem like this is an area where China wants to at least appear to be pulling ahead. So is this technology as good as China wants it to look?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think we've seen a lot of these promotional videos and they're extremely impressive in terms of what the robots can do physically, right? But therein, I think, lies the biggest misunderstanding is that what a robot can do physically is oftentimes, actually, for the most part, pre-programmed or remote controlled. So a lot of the videos we see, pre-recorded videos, or even some of the demos we see when Chinese robots go to CES, for example, this electronics show, they're pre-programmed or sometimes remote controlled by a controller by an engineer on site. So that really speaks to the difficult part of the humanoid robot question.
So in many cases, we're probably not seeing embodied AI at all in some of these showcases. It's just the hardware.
Exactly. We're seeing robotics, which is impressive on its own, but we're not really seeing autonomous AI. We're quite far from that, frankly.
And just to take a step back, there's robotics, there's embodied AI, they're increasingly discussed kind of in the same breath. Where's the line between those two sectors and how would you define those spaces in Chinese industry?
Yeah, so there's robotics, which is just machines that do stuff automatically. So the biggest install base, the industrial robots that we're discussing, all falls under that. Now, embodied AI, which is a term that Chinese policy likes to use, basically refers to physical AI, which is combining AI with anything that has a body. So electric vehicles often fall under this discussion, and so do humanoid robots. So in our report, we make that distinction between the industrial robots, but also we look at humanoid robots, which is really a budding industry. And so far, China owns like 90% of all the humanoid robots that were shipped last year. But this is still a very early industry and these numbers are still small.
So is it fair to say that when it comes to humanoid robots, I mean, China is ahead, but we shouldn't overstate how much progress has been achieved so far?
I think we can say that they're winning at this early moment in numbers, right? They're shipping something like 90% of all the units shipped. But if you look at that number, most of it is also being shipped to China, being bought by Chinese businesses, Chinese government agencies to serve a demonstration purpose or an educational purpose. And if you look at a lot of the leading innovations in robotics, they are still being made by American companies, but just those per unit robots are way more expensive.
Which seems like a story we've seen before in terms of how China's been able to translate scale and clustered industrial sectors into kind of an enduring edge. A story that I think is most familiar to many of us in the electric vehicle and battery sector, but it sounds like you're describing what might be the early stages of a similar path, though a very early stage in that path. So probably too early to say in a more definitive way.
Exactly. I think China's following the same industrial policy playbook.
They don't have that many playbooks.
Exactly. That's how they wanted to play out if they could.
I'd love to get into a little more of the how of all of this. So, like, who actually deserves the credit? To the degree that China has seen some significant initial successes in the cutting edge of robotics and the beginnings of embodied AI, to what degree is this a story of successful industrial policy or a story of an incredibly entrepreneurial private sector?
I think it's both. So industrial policy will send out a signal, I think, for the private industry to follow. So once the MIIT, like we said, has designated humanoid robots a disruptive technology, that gives industry then the signal to pile in. This is where we should get into business, producing up and down the supply chain, basically. They know this is where the money will go, so industry joins. Private capital also follows, following some guidance funds and regional funds, and the whole thing follows from there.
It seems like from your report that foreign companies and experts have contributed in a significant way to China's progress in robotics, especially thinking about NVIDIA semiconductors, but also more broadly, what we're really looking at when we talk about robotics is a complicated global supply chain. So can you just tell us a little more about how international players fit into China's effort to indigenize these robotics capabilities?
Yes, it's very interesting in a way, since China's AI industry is suffering so much from semiconductor export controls from the US that they continue to be so dependent on NVIDIA, but that's pretty much where they're at. There's still a very strong dependence on NVIDIA for both the AI chips themselves, but also on the ecosystem, both on the models. So there's something called the VLA, which is the vision, language, action model that are being used by humanoid robots, and the training environments for humanoid robots and the world models. All of these technical ecosystem is to a large extent being provided by NVIDIA and other Western companies. Chinese companies, of course, are building their own. They're following the developments of these companies from the West. But by and large, NVIDIA still plays a very large role in that supply, especially for the chips.
So there's a separate policy conversation about restrictions on the very highest end semiconductors produced by or designed by American companies, including NVIDIA. This actually isn't about that, right? It's the more mid-range NVIDIA capabilities that are being used by Chinese robotics companies to run their systems, to drive the cutting edge of humanoid robots. And while I guess you would assume that they would always prefer to have access to an even higher capability, that mid-range has been sufficient to power the leading edge of some forms of robotics. Is that a fair assessment?
Right. The chips and the systems required to run robotics are different from the AI chips that are under export controls. So for the moment, there's no discussion of restricting these chips, and they're fine. And NVIDIA is really trying to make itself indispensable in the robotics AI ecosystem as well. So these are different chips for now.
To get into the politics of it all, you talk in the report about Xi Jinping as a techno-solutionist, and it does seem like there is nothing Xi's new quality productive forces can't solve, or at least that is the bet he has repeatedly made. Is that a good bet?
So the bet on new quality productive forces basically is a bet on the idea that technology will always continue to solve all of CCP's problems or all of China's problems. So they are increasingly facing an aging population and a shrinking workforce, and they want to continue being very export driven in their economy and continue being the world's factory, right? So this techno-solutionist mindset really believes that if they continue to automate their factories, if they continue to produce higher level goods, they can continue their growth and continue to secure their economic security. Now, is this a good bet? I think, of course, this approach has problems, right? All of this massive industrial policy comes at the expense of building a proper social safety net or of policies to boost domestic consumption. So China continues to be very reliant on an export-driven economy, and it's led to overcapacities, which in turn has impact on the rest of the world. So I don't know if the new productive forces will really be the end-all be-all and that it wouldn't have any side effects. That's far from the case. But for now, that seems to be China's play that they're keeping up with.
We definitely saw that in the new 5-year plan, which was adopted earlier this year, where the party doubles down on technology and exports as the primary drivers of China's continued economic growth at a time when economic growth is facing a lot of headwinds. And I think robotics and embodied AI fit into the new 5-year plan in a really interesting way. So I'd love to hear more about how the new plan treats this sector. And then relatedly, to what degree does that matter? Like when we look at these high level Chinese policy documents, is that really driving the direction of the sector, and in what ways?
Yeah, I think robotics being a key technology in the policy definitely has an effect, like we say, a signaling effect for the industry to continue taking off. I think it enables policy to be made and money to be allotted regionally as well as centrally. And I think that in turn will guarantee that the sector continues to thrive. And also it gives a signal to private investors to continue investing in these companies.
It's such a good point that a huge effect of prioritization in the 5-year plan or in other policy planning documents in China is directing capital and also a signal to local governments that this is where they should be directing capital. But of course, that has given rise in some sectors, I mean, maybe most famously in EVs and batteries, but in a lot of sectors to what is now affectionately termed involution, which is effectively, overcapacity leading to overcompetition, leading to no one making any money, even in sectors that have demonstrated pretty incredible innovation. So is there an involution risk with robotics, or are we not seeing those challenges yet?
I would say absolutely, since it shares so much of the same DNA as some of these other supply chains, like we talked about EVs and industrial robotics. So when I was doing the research for this report and looking up the local companies that are making certain key parts, for example, the motors or the reducers, so these mechanical parts of a humanoid robot, you'll see just tons of names of companies that are producing the same parts. Right? And I think that's a key sign of just fierce competition, which is very common in China.
And presumably every local government wants to create their own local provider of everything, even if maybe that's not, strictly speaking, necessary for the success of the overall national sector.
Exactly. That's a key characteristic, right? Between the regional governments, they are also competing to have the most successful ecosystem because they each may have ambition to become the robotics hub. So there's definitely built-in inefficiencies, let's say.
And in looking at this array of robotics companies around the country, your report has a really interesting breakdown of where all these players are actually located in clusters across China. And I thought it was interesting that your report observes that when it comes to humanoid robotics firms, the largest cluster by a significant margin is actually in Beijing, clocking in at 17 companies in comparison to 11 in Shenzhen and 9 in Shanghai. And I think we don't often think of Beijing as like the hub of scientific innovation necessarily. So that stood out to me. Why Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, I should point out that this map in our report, it's only looking at some top key companies, but there are really way more companies than that, right? But it's true that we identified Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen as the 3 key clusters. And Beijing is interesting, I think, because one, it's one of the regions that has a massive regional fund. So it's one of the regions that's pushing its local humanoid robots the most. And very importantly, Beijing is also where a lot of the top tech universities in the country are located. So that creates, I think, an engineering hub. That's why if you look at the companies that are clustered there, it's more the humanoids. So it's more research-based, more AI-driven, more startups. Whereas if you look at Shanghai and Shenzhen, it's more these companies that are more focused on the manufacturing side of things. So about building the robot body, whereas maybe it's more the robot brain and AI. These companies are more based in Beijing.
It seems like maybe the big companies in Beijing have more space to take a step back from immediate commercial pressures or immediate application, whereas in Shenzhen, it's more about how do we get this on a factory floor as soon as possible.
Yeah, there's that. And it's also important to maybe take a step back and point out that robotics is a big problem. And a lot of these companies that we look at in the report are tackling it from different angles. So the ones that we're most familiar with, Unitree, UBTech, AGBot, these really big ones, they tend to be more focused on building the body first, very roughly speaking, of course. Whereas there are also companies that are closer to the Silicon Valley companies where they're focused more on the AI training, the brain of it, if you will. So maybe more of these types of companies are based out of Beijing.
And if we think about China's national capability when it comes to the cutting edge of robotics, embodied AI, does it make sense to think of kind of the aggregate capabilities and potential of these different companies, or should we see them exclusively as competitors with each other?
I think it makes some sense to see them in the aggregate in the sense that it's also very common for Chinese companies to collaborate. And you see that effect a lot in the robotics industry. Maybe not directly across robotics companies, but certainly between robotics companies and, say, EV industry, there's a huge crossover. And the EV industries, for example, will invite humanoid robot companies to put their robots on the factory floor for training and for quicker integration to figure out what ways these robots can be useful on the factory floor, for example. And I think whoever emerges victorious in China, because of the involution, because of the massive number of players, at some point there will be consolidation. And I think the consolidated winner in the end, we can expect will have the best of what China can offer.
The best of everyone.
Yeah.
In the conversation so far, it's been very clear that policy direction from the center has been instrumental in how the robotics sector in China has evolved, the pace of evolution as well. But short of Xi Jinping himself, who is actually making these decisions in the government and in the party when it comes to Chinese policy on robotics and embodied AI in terms of particularly powerful individual players, but institutions as well?
I think the MIIT, of course, is a big player, the Administration of Industry and Information Technology. But in general, I think just because tech is just a big part of Chinese policy. So it's, like you said, part of the 5-year plan. It's kind of baked into the overall industrial policy and economic policy.
In the US, the conversation around automation, going back way before AI, but even more so now, often focuses on questions of the social safety net and jobs and people losing their jobs. And in China, we are seeing incredibly high youth unemployment, but then also difficult questions related to demographic change around a declining workforce over time. So you see arguments, I think, in both directions, saying that on the one hand, automation and robotics and embodied AI might actually solve an emerging labor challenge as the workforce ages. But on the other hand, in the immediate term, you have an unemployment crisis that these innovations could exacerbate. And in such a complicated context, it's interesting that Chinese policymakers, at least in public, don't seem very concerned regarding the labor dislocations that embodied AI could potentially create, or at least not in comparison to the somewhat doomerist discourse that we have here in the US and often in Europe. So what should we make of that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think on the whole, or at a glance, you do see Chinese experts seem to have an overall more optimistic outlook when it comes to AI's impact on jobs or AI's impact on society as a whole, really. But I think this is because it's somewhat harmonized with policy. So I think it's kind of aligned with Chinese policy, that techno-solutionism that we talk about in general. So that's why when we read comments, it tends to focus on the bright side. It tends to argue that, sure, AI could take away some jobs, but it could also create new products and services that will then give rise to more jobs. But with that said, I think the Chinese government is not unaware. They're just kind of focused on, going all in on automation and investing in AI. But they are also making preparations for potential impact on jobs. So recently there's been a slew of policy, or maybe not full-blown policy, but there's measures released by the Chinese government that talks about jobs. So there are specific ones that say this is how guidelines on creating jobs in this and that emerging sector, including one in the marine sector. And there's also a 5-year plan called Employment First about how new sector development should also take into account job creation. So I think we will continue to see more and more Beijing doing something about jobs, but it's just that I think it's kind of the party line that no, AI is not going to create massive unemployment. It's going to be fine. But I think in reality, the social safety net in China is quite lacking already. And unemployment is high, especially youth unemployment. There's already a large gig economy of gig economy workers, and that's probably going to be made worse by AI. So I think it comes down to if Beijing can really change or strengthen their work policy or social policy to cope with that.
It's fascinating that for a party so deeply fixated on maintaining social stability, they just seem not that worried about this huge potential transformation of the society and what it could mean for people's everyday lives. Or maybe it's not that they're not concerned, it's that they just, at least by policy anyway, have incredible confidence that ultimately the aggregate outcome will be positive. But it's funny because even if that's true, even if the aggregate outcome is positive, the dislocations that you could see beneath that average could be incredibly significant. And in looking at the measures that have been announced related to employment stability in new sectors, is that just statements that it should matter? Or do you see real measures there, real policy, real action to create more employment stability within these cutting edge sectors, or as these cutting edge sectors increasingly dominate the broader economy?
Well, it's early days still, but there have been some court cases recently that were well reported on that ruled against employers from firing people based on AI displacement. And of course, it hasn't turned into a full-blown policy yet, but it's an early indication that Beijing may ask its companies to share the burden a bit more. It might be a bit more restrictive when it comes to streamlining people, if you will. So that might be one way that they try to go that's a little bit different from Western policy. In general, yeah, I think it remains to be seen, really.
And at the same time, as all of this is happening inside China, I think in capitals in Europe, Japan, the US, policymakers are increasingly puzzling over the best way to manage and compete with China's growing capabilities in robotics and embodied AI. You mentioned at the beginning that it's still European and Japanese companies that dominate the larger forms of robotics globally, but you can see these industries in Europe, Japan already losing ground in pretty significant ways. So for those officials in Tokyo and Brussels, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so the US definitely still holds significant, important technological leadership in certain parts of the humanoid AI whole ecosystem, especially on the software side, like we talked about. So I think for them, it's important to hold on to those advantages and just think about how they can beef up the hardware supply chain in a way to strengthen their existing companies. So Tesla is still a leader, maybe supporting other new ones. For Europe, the situation is slightly different. They are actually a little bit more like China in that they have more the hardware supply chain. They would need to work with the US also for software. And like we said, they already have existing production capabilities for a lot of the high-end stuff. So what Europe needs, I think, are strong companies in the leadership position to play the integrator role. So piece together the supply chain, produce European-made humanoid robots. And I think on both sides, they need to make policy to protect a potential flooding of the market before they're ready by Chinese competitors who are going to be a lot cheaper, and to avoid the fight being over before it begins.
And Wendy, you're actually sitting in Berlin, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a really interesting conversation in Germany right now about Germany's industrial edge and losing it quickly to Chinese competitors. So how have you seen the conversation, even just in Berlin, in terms of how advances in embodied AI, in robotics, are going to shape the future of how Germany needs to think about global economic security? And I ask in part because if we think about the future of European policy in Brussels and the European Union, I mean, I think in the past, Germany's hesitance to take big steps to deal with broader issues of Chinese overcapacity have been a limiting factor for Europe as a whole. And it seems like that may be starting to change as the scale of the challenge kind of becomes more apparent. But how does that look to you?
Yeah, certainly the challenges come one after another. And I think they keep proving the same point that there has to be something done about China. So both either in EVs or in robotics that we're talking about, or in something else, say semiconductors, a lot of different manufacturing where China is challenging manufacturing that's traditionally been very strong from Germany. So I think there's more talk of whether industrial policy makes sense or funding and these kinds of things.
We're almost out of time. I just want to ask one more question about how we should think about where robotics fits into China's broader innovation ecosystem in G7 capitals. There's been a lot of focus on very high-end semiconductor capabilities. And you can argue by how much, but I think there's a sense that US firms are still significantly ahead in that space, even as Chinese competitors work very hard to indigenize their own leading edge. Then you have on the other side of the how are G7 countries doing spectrum, EVs and battery technology, where we're doing very badly by comparison to Chinese players that are just dominating the global space. And then you have robotics and embodied AI. And it seems from our conversation that where China's industry, where China's capability fits into, a global spectrum is maybe somewhere in the middle between that semiconductor and that EV conversation. But China's ambitions for embodied AI are racing ahead. And they clearly have a vision for leading the world comprehensively in this space, in a space that's increasingly going to represent the future of manufacturing broadly. So how would you contextualize where China sits on embodied AI within this broader ecosystem of innovation and China's broader efforts to indigenize everything?
Yeah. So embodied AI is an interesting case in that there's a hardware component and a software component, and China's very good at the hardware component, as we know, and they are more spotty on the software side or the AI side, let's say, but they are definitely making advances and could become competitive. On the hardware side, they're very competitive, of course, because of supply chains and all that stuff. So it's closer to an EV fight. I should add that on semiconductors, China is also really making advances. It's kind of similar. On the lower end, they are starting to mass produce and increase their export volumes. On the higher end, they're still seeking breakthroughs, so trying, but relying on their own internal consumption to continue to drive the R&D. So I think embodied AI, since it comprises both EVs and robots and different kinds of robots, you can see it somewhere in the middle. And I think we can expect to see a lot of small breakthroughs happening very fast over the next few years. And I think it would be key to see if they're able to really turn it into a useful technology, first of all, and really commodify it. So once it turns into something they can produce very cheaply, then it's over.
Well, Wendy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
To learn more about China's strategy, progress, and challenges when it comes to embodied AI and robotics, you can read Wendy's new report on the MERICS website, and that is called Embodied AI, China's Ambitious Path to Transform its Robotics Industry. You can also check out the MERICS China Tech Observatory for more information on all things new quality productive forces. And as always, we would love to hear what you thought of today's conversation and what issues you would like to see Pekingology unpack in future episodes. You can send your ideas to pekingology@csis.org. And if you haven't already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It helps us a lot. And we will be back in your feed very soon.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.